Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to go into the segment of this service where we are going into our program, Understanding and Learning About Your Child with Autism and Learning Differences. We're so privileged to have a few professionals in the field this morning with us. And as I call them their name and talk a little bit about them, they can make their way to the stage. I do ask that if you know in advance that you have a question that you would like to ask over the course of this program, just wave your hand and the ushers have pens and they have cards so that you can either write down your question or later on, if you feel comfortable standing up to say your question aloud, you can also do that as well. So our first speaker, who is a part of the panel, his name is Dr. Evan Skolnick. Dr. Skolnick is a New York State licensed psychologist who received his doctorate in school psychology from the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. He is a school psychologist at East Meadow School District, bringing experience from previous roles at Quahog Union Free School District, Delaware County Intermediate Unit, Agora Cyber Charter School, and the Brooklyn Autism Center. He has extensive experience assessing and treating children, adults, and young adults in school-based and private settings. Special areas of interest comprise child and family concerns such as depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, behavioral disorders, trauma, parenting issues, and school functioning. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Skolnick. Our next speaker will be Miss Balajoko Oshikanlu, also known as Auntie Bala, right? Ms. Oshikanlu is a licensed occupational therapist in New York, boasting a rich educational background. She holds a graduate degree from New York Institute of Technology, supplemented with certifications in early intervention from SUNY Downstate and assistive technology from CSUN, Northridge, California. Additionally, she earned a master's in special education from LIU, the Long Island University. With over 24 years of experience in occupational therapy, Ms. Oshikanlu has dedicated her career to assisting children and adults with diverse disabilities. She currently serves as an occupational therapist and assistive technology specialist at Nassau BOCES and as an occupational therapist at Portledge School in Locust Valley, New York. Beyond her professional endeavors, Ms. Oshikanlu contributes to the field through her involvement on the board of directors at the Tabitha Therapeutic Consultation Services and Focused Developmental Disability Group. She's also on the advisory board of the Gabby Williams Alzheimer's Foundation in Nigeria. So thank you so much for being part of this program. And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Alessandra Baragato. Ms. Baragato is a licensed speech and language pathologist in New York State, currently serving as an AAC evaluator and trainer at Nassau BOCES. She earned her bachelor's degree in communication sciences from Hofstra University in 1998 and a master's degree in speech and language pathology from Adelphi University in 2000. In addition to her coursework in speech and language disorders, she earned additional credit hours in reading instruction, bilingual education, multiculturalism, and collaborative teaching methods. Alessandra brings over 20 years of experience working with students with autism and related communication disorders. Spanning ages 3 to 21, she has provided therapy in both individual and collaborative settings. Beyond her direct work with students, Alessandra is passionate about sharing her expertise. For over a decade, she has taught professional development courses, disseminating knowledge in speech and language to professionals across Long Island. Outside of her professional commitments, Alessandra has been married to her husband, Phil, for over 20 years and owns a national bread distribution company. They have 3 children, Philip, who will be a senior at Siena College in the fall, majoring in secondary math education, Nicholas, who will be a sophomore in the fall, majoring in computer science, and Juliana, who will be beginning her freshman year at the high school at Elwood John Glenn. As a family, they enjoy activities such as traveling and cooking. Thank you so much, Ms. Pargato. So again, I ask that if you have any questions, that you save them until the end. If you know that it's a question that's of more private in nature, you can surely just write it down and we can find a way for that question to be addressed, okay? So at this moment, we're going to begin our program. For those of you guys who don't know, and I think everybody does know, my name is Tutu. I'm one of the teachers here in the church, in the children's department downstairs. I'm also a special education teacher outside of the church. So we're going to begin. And our first question is going to be for Ms. Baragato, our speech therapist. So first, I would just like for you to tell us, what do you do as a speech therapist, day to day, and in general, what can a speech therapist do?
Thank you so much. So speech therapy is a big field, and initially, when I started as a speech therapist, I thought that I was really focusing on speech, on articulation, correcting how children speak, helping them to become more fluent speakers, and helping them to be understood by their peers and their families. But there is a bigger piece to speech-language pathology, and that's really the language development. So in my field, and really what I've been focusing on primarily in the last 18 plus years, is language development. So working with students who may not be able to express themselves verbally and trying to provide support for them to communicate, either by using alternative means such as visuals or electronic devices, or by just helping them to scaffold what they're saying to help them become more independent speakers. So it's really a huge, huge field.
Thank you for that response. And with that, I'll ask you a question that is on our list. So you spoke about supporting children who may have some difficulties or some challenges with speaking, not just articulation. So the first question for you is that my child was recommended for speech services, but they have no problem with speaking. What could be the reason?
So a few reasons could be that maybe they're not speaking at the same level as their peers. So sometimes students may not be able to speak as eloquently, meaning their peers might be speaking 2, 3, 4 word messages, but maybe the child is only speaking in a 1-word message. Sometimes we focus on language in terms of relatability. So maybe your child may be able to speak, but maybe what they're speaking about may not be related to what the context is. So we have a lot of our students that are special needs. They understand that they're supposed to be saying something, but they may not have the words yet that are relatable enough to speak in the content. So sometimes in the context. So sometimes speech therapists focus on understanding what's being asked of our students and teaching them skills so that they can speak related to what the context is. So even though your child may have language, they may have to learn how to understand what they're being asked and then formulate a message that's related to what they're being asked. So that's a different piece of language development and understanding.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The next question is for Ms. Oshikono, our occupational therapist.
Thank you.
So could you explain to us what an occupational therapist is and why we would need an occupational therapist?
Okay. When you talk about occupational therapy, you have to look at the person. Everybody has an occupation. Everybody has a role to play. My occupation is a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I'm a member of this church. And in order for me to perform my occupation, I have to be able to participate. I have to be able to engage. So I have roles that I have to play. And as an occupational therapist, my job is to help people who have challenges with performing those occupations become as independent as possible in the immediate environment. So when we talk about kids with autism, usually, or kids with challenges who have independent and individual needs, we're talking about what their occupation is. As a child, the first occupation you really have is to play. So some of these kids don't even know how to play. They don't know how to interact with their peers. So as an occupational therapist, I'll come in and I'll work with them to see how I can assist. Another task is for them to just interact and participate within that environment. How do I get dressed? How do I eat my food? How do I express also? That way I kind of overlap with the speech language pathologist, and I would have to communicate with the speech language pathologist and say, my child that I'm working with has this need. How do you want me to address it? So basically my job as an occupational therapist is to make that child as independent as possible in that immediate environment. There are other occupational therapists that work on rehab. When I work with kids with special needs, I'm doing habilitation because those needs are not there. And what I'm trying to do is build that. Whereas the OTs who work outside, who are trying to rehabilitate somebody who's probably had a stroke or somebody who was in a motor vehicle accident. But when we're talking about the kids we have now, we're basically doing habilitation because we're trying to work with them at this time. I hope that...
Yes, it does. It sounds like a lot of what you and Ms. Baragato do help support children learn, play, and grow, which is very important. So thank you for that. Dr. Skolnick, can you explain to us what a child psychologist is and how, you support children with autism and learning differences?
Right, so a school psychologist, it's in the name, we work in a school, but I also work in private settings with children and adults who have a variety of different emotional regulation, social skill deficits. And it's my job to work in the school to obviously help the committee work together. So oftentimes myself and the other professionals who you have on the committee are working to collaborate to firstly identify, so I do a lot of assessments, identify what are the child's needs, how are they differing from what's expected from other children at their age level, and to answer the question, do they need specially designed instruction? Do they need extra support? So I play a large role in that assessment process, and then working with the team to develop and understand what type of treatment the child might need that is different from what they might get in an ordinary classroom, right? And determining, does that child need to be in a completely different classroom? Do they need to be pulled out to work on different skills throughout the day, whether it be reading, whether it be social skills, self-help skills? I work as a consultant with teachers to help them understand their students who may learn differently or may have delays. And I work with parents to do the same, to help them understand what's going on in the school building, what supports might exist in their community, and how to direct them to those supports. And lastly, I work with the children. I wish I worked with the children more. I do a lot of as I mentioned, consultation and working with the team. But I do work with children on, as I mentioned, helping them to understand their emotions better, regulate them better, interact more appropriately with the people in their lives. And so it's a diverse role, and I really enjoy it.
Thank you, Dr. Skolnick. And again, we're so grateful for your wealth of knowledge that you bring to this panel. So the next question is for Ms. Baragato. How do I know if my child needs more time or is actually delayed? Is there such thing as seeking help too early?
So as parents and family members, we see our children daily, and of course, and we look at them and we love them, right? And we want to make sure that they are doing the best that they can. When you have a child that has, learning the differences or identifying the differences between normal language development and maybe some development that could use some support, I feel like the biggest indicator is frustration. And we know what it's like to be frustrated when you can't communicate, whether it's you don't have the time or you don't have the words, or you just, or maybe there's a challenges in language, but when we see our children, and if you see that there's a level of frustration, and it's recurrent, and it's daily, and it's over simple things that you really would expect your child to be able to ask for, that's when we know that it's time to ask someone else for help, right? And I feel like that's the biggest indicator. When you ask a speech pathologist, oh, when is it too early to ask for help? And I'm going to tell you it's never too early, because this is what I do. And we can always benefit from learning, and we can always benefit from a little support, especially when when we have young children. We know that it's very hard. So that's where reaching out for help, whether it's within the community or if it's within your school district, it's always beneficial. So I have 3 children, and I always, everyone was assessed. I was always worried about their communication, especially when I looked at it in terms of their frustration level. And all 3 of my children had speech therapy and language therapy, and probably all day long therapy with me. So I mean, continually to this day. But it's something that I was happy that I seeked, because it's okay to hear that that your child, it's a typical language development, and it's okay. It's okay to have someone say, all right, let's seek out some more help. Maybe you could use some support. Or maybe you get the response like, oh, you know what, some of this is typical, but maybe give it another month or 2. And if you're still seeing some challenges, then let's talk about it. So I don't think, I guess in summary, I never think it's a bad thing to ask. I think it's always good to refer to somebody else, because you never know. You just never know what you could do to help your child develop.
Yes, thank you. It sounds like you're saying that it's never too early. And just a reminder, when we had that previous presentation, early intervention is from birth to 3 years old. So if they're offering services from birth and you start to notice some difficulties or challenges, early intervention is the best way to go in terms of reaching out to get those services. And as a parent, I can attest to that as well. So then the next question is for Dr. Skolnick. Because early intervention is up until 3 years old, after then, the students then go into preschool, or something called CPSE, through their school district. What about the children who are already in school or school age? The next question says, I think my child may have signs of learning challenges, but they're too old for early intervention. Is it too late for them?
No, it's never too late for any type of intervention. There are things that I've probably ignored my entire life that, as a 37-year-old individual, I could still get help with. But no, we're fortunate to live in a country that offers special education services from an early age up to the age of 21 for free. So if you didn't refer your child before the age of 3, yes, there is something called CPSE, preschool special education, and all you have to do is reach out to your school district special education office and describe the needs of your child, and they'll arrange, for an evaluation for a team of individuals like us to let you know, does my child qualify for the additional service? But I work in a high school as my day job, and I'm sometimes evaluating and diagnosing and creating treatment plans for 14-year-old children. And, although they maybe could have benefited from that support from a very young age, the support that they're now able to access in high school is allowing them to be successful and pass and to go on to do great things. So the short answer is no, it's never too late to seek out early intervention. It's never too late to seek out any type of intervention.
Thank you. It is never too late to seek help or interventions. Thank you, Dr. Skolnick. Ms. Oshikonu, What are the most common challenges that you see with young children, particularly in children with autism? And how can a parent help support or help face those challenges, so to speak?
I'm going to also ask Ali and Dr. Skolnick to help me here if I
Sure.
miss out on certain things. So language, that's the big one. So we're talking to kids, they're having issues with reception of the language and expression of the language. We're also seeing kids who are having repetitive behavior. So there's certain things that you want them to do and they are not, all they're doing is the same thing over and over again. You also see certain behaviors where there's a lot of hand flapping, there's issues with covering their ears sometimes when it comes to sensory issues. Some of them overreact to stimuli they get. Some of them are underreactive to stimuli they get. Help me here, what else?
Repetitive words.
Repetitive words, echolalia. What else?
Decreased eye contact.
Okay, eye contact. We also have issues with eye contact as well. So
Restricted dietary, right? Only eating a certain types of foods, certain types of textures, having difficulty with certain textures of clothing, those types of things.
like some of the kids I have, Dr. Skolnick is talking about clothing. Some of them don't like tags. Some of them, and it's not just kids who are diagnosed as students with autism. Also, there are also kids who have challenges when it comes to wearing other items and wearing clothing items. Some kids don't like wearing socks. Like, there are some kids that, as an occupational therapist, I find out that the best way for them to wear socks is to turn it inside out, because they'll say it's like bugs going up their legs. Sometimes as Nigerians, we get really upset that we put on socks for the kids and they're taking it off. So what we have to do is learn about our kids, basically learn who your child is, and then ask questions. Why is this child always doing this? Some of our kids will take off shoes. They don't want to wear shoes. Some of our kids like dinosaurs. So we talk about them having just a narrow point of interest. So there's so many things that we will see. What we also have to remember, and we see that as therapists, is that the children we work with are individuals, and one child who has a diagnosis of autism is different from the next child. What works with child A doesn't always work with child B. And so that's one of the reasons we always have to learn about that child, learn what that child's sensory needs are. Learn, is that child a sensory seeking child? Is that child, like some parents will say, he's always on the move. He's so clumsy. So what are the issues that this child is having? And that's when you have to really ask for assistance. It's never too late to ask for assistance, and it's okay to ask for assistance. Some of us, and pardon me if I'm going further, some of us are nervous about our kids being labeled. But what I want us to understand is, if there's no label, it's difficult to address the challenge. When you go to a medical doctor, the medical doctor will tell you, and I've shared with the church before, I'm diabetic. I'll go in and the doctor says, you're diabetic, you have to take this medication. So I have to take the medication. If I don't want to, I can say, I'm not taking it and the doctor was wrong. But people see that. With kids who have challenges, sometimes we don't see these things. So, or we see certain things and we don't see other things. So we have to learn that child, and we have to agree that it's okay to label so that we can address that challenge and really work on it. And then we can have the experts come in and help with those kids. And there are other experts. It's not just speech language pathologists. It's not just school psychologists. There are physical therapists. There's recreation therapists who also work with the kids.
Thank you. The next question is actually for everyone on the panel. So I heard a lot about sensory or sensory seeking stimuli. What does that mean, and what does it look like in each of your fields?
a lot of the children that we work with are, I work with a lot of inattentive or hyperactive children, right? So they are seeking out a lot of sensory input, right? They're on the move. They are easily distracted. They have trouble sitting, just doing one task and inhibiting their desire to go do another task. So, a lot of what I do is to help those children manage those impulses and help their parents create an environment that helps them do that as well.
So when it comes to sensory and speech, I think what really is standing in my mind is the sensory needs of our students are really what either helps or prevents them from learning language. So when I think about sensory, some of my, I give a little grace. So some of my students they're unable to work on speech work or speech therapy sitting. They just can't sit. And that's because for whatever reason, they're fidgeting or maybe their shoes are annoying them, or maybe they don't have seats with sides, so they feel like they're falling. So when I look at sensory, I see that I'd like to help my child to be as sensory calm as they can. And so because of that, I may allow things that don't really seem like your typical, permissions that you would give to your child. So maybe that child has to stand when they're working on an activity, or maybe they need more frequent breaks, or they need to take a break and have really a silence or a quiet room, and then they can come back to me. So sensory is like the sensory, I guess it provides a threshold of what my child can do at that time. And I try to be very responsive to it because I don't want to put them into a state of flight or upsetness. So so again, it helps me, if I'm aware of their sensory needs, it gauges how far I can push and my expectations. And when I'm talking about speech therapy and communication and sensory needs, day to day, my needs vary. So my children and my students, their needs vary too. So maybe on a Monday, Monday morning when I go to work, sometimes my threshold is not great. And believe me, nobody wants to be at work on a Monday unless you see Vola in your office and it's a little bit better. But so I just try to be as aware of my children and students' needs as best as I can, and giving them the grace that not every day is going to be the same. And there'll be some days that they might be able to communicate better and perform better. And there are going to be days that they're going to need a pass. So that's where I look at the sensory needs of my students.
When I look at sensory needs, I'm looking at it also from the point of an occupational therapist. When we talk about senses, usually all of us think of the five senses: the taste, the touch, the hearing, the seeing, and the smell. But as an occupational therapist, I know there are more senses. So there's a sense of your position. So we're talking about the vestibular, the sense of where you are in time. So those also affect the kids that we work with. Some kids don't like Dr. Skolnick had said, the texture of the food in their mouth. So we'll find that there are certain kids who only eat certain things. They would only eat McDonald's fries, nothing else. You give them Wendy's fries, they take it out. You give them any kind of food, it has to do with their taste buds. Some kids, like Mrs. Bagato had said, have a feeling that they're falling. So when they're sitting, you want to give them chairs with arms. So basically, it's us learning who our kids are, learning what their needs are, and then providing those needs. And what we do in occupational therapy, we'll say it's all in participation. So we want to engage the student, we want to engage the child, we want the child to participate. So we have to address those sensory needs in order for us to participate. And I'll go back again. The reason when we come to sensory needs, sensory integration, It goes back to Dr. Jean Ayres in the 70s, who found out that there were certain kids who lacked the ability to do activities because the feedback loop wasn't there. So there's certain things that they were getting in, or it was too much that they were getting in, and therefore they shut down and shut out what was going on. So when we learn what's happening with our kids, then we're able to address those needs.
Thank you. From all three of you guys, it sounds like sensory and sensory seeking, sensory integration is something that can be done not just in the place of therapies or school, but also in the home. My question is, and it's for every single one of you again, how can we support our children in the home in the areas of speech, in the areas of occupational therapy, or as a psychologist, how can we support practical ways, to support our children?
So I think it depends on your child and their ages. But one thing that I find is very successful is really thinking about your communication interactions and thinking about your expectations for your response. But you also have to keep in mind your child's age and really their independent production. So we're looking at little babies that they don't have any language. If I'm going to model language, what's important for that child to say? So we want them to have some words direct, right? We want them to be able to say, go, stop. Some of these words that we say in our daily life, we want them to have access to that. So that's for you. So for younger children, that would be the language that I would model. Some language, we call it like advocacy. So we want language that your child can use that would allow them to direct actions. And of course, we do, when you have a child with learning challenges, I don't want to say we want little bossy children, but initially we do. We want our children to be able to say stop or more or give me, because that's the beginning of their ability to really express their wants and needs, in addition to labeling the items in their house that are important to them, whatever cookies or their drinks or their favorite foods or their favorite toys. So as a parent, I would make sure that my child is hearing those words. So if you're turning on a TV, you might say on or TV or Wonder Pets, giving your children the labels for the items that are in their environment. Now, if you have a child that already has language and you're trying to expand that language, then what they say independently. So let's say your child says, ice cream. So model language. Oh, you want to eat ice cream. You want more ice cream. You want to get ice cream. So we have to just be aware of what they're doing independently and try to give them one or two words more beyond, so that they're hearing their expected script, right? What they're expected to say as they get older.
Thank you. So it sounds like modeling language, giving them functional words to use, and kind of expanding their current utterances. That is amazing. Thank you so much, Ms. Barakato.
I mean, there's a lot you can do in terms of creating routine, repetition, structure, right? The use of schedules, setting clear expectations. But one of the most number one important things you can do is to take care of yourself as a parent. As a parent, I'm fortunate enough to have a 7 and 8 year olds who are, I guess, relatively typical in terms of, they thank goodness they don't have severe learning disabilities or severe social communication disabilities. And I'm stressed all the time. And so we know that when parents receive, especially an autism diagnosis, it could be one of the most stressful things someone can experience. And it can cause us to shut down, become overwhelmed as parents. And so my advice to parents is just to find the things that keep you calm, keep you steady, right? This idea of caring for the caregiver. Because if you're not feeling great, you're not going to parent very well either. One rule of thumb is, think about your interactions with your children, and they come home from school and it's like, get your homework out and we have dinner in 30 minutes and clean your room and this and that. If you find that a lot of your interactions are just do this, do that, you'll have a lot more success if you can engage with your children, give them praise, point out what they're doing well, or even just ask them how their day was, or what's that on your shirt? What does that mean? Just engaging. Put like 4 times the amount of money in the bank account with your kid before you start asking for them to do things, before you make that withdrawal. So just be aware of yourself and that balance you have.
Wow, I think that's so important. Thank you, Dr. Skolnick. Ms. Oshikola, would you like to share what are some practical ways we can help our children?
I'll say ditto to what both of them have said. Take care of yourself, and again, I'm going to repeat: learn about your child. Learn that child. Learn what that child needs, and then when communication comes in, something I want Ali to talk about is that some of us believe that speaking is communicating. There are other ways of communication, because some of our kids are nonverbal and they cannot say what they want to say, but there are other means of speaking to us. So we also have to learn about that child. And the more you know your child, the better you'll be able to help that child. And be good to yourself in the sense that don't feel guilty. Don't think it's all your fault. And don't be afraid to ask for help. If somebody says no, go to the next person and ask. And just reach out. Today the pastor talked about ask and you'll receive. Yes, ask. And keep asking, keep knocking at that door. Don't give up. Don't give up on you. Don't give up on that child. Don't give up on that therapist. Then when whoever you're working with, what type of therapist you're working with, find out who that person is. Find out what that person is doing with your child. And try and duplicate it. If it's not working for you at home, contact that therapist or that person who's helping your child and say, I'm doing this at home. It's not working. How come it's working for you? It might be the environment. So basically, as an OT, also what we'll do is we'll adapt. So what we're trying to do is respond to the needs that that child has, and then adapt the environment, adapt the situation so that there's better what we call modulation. So if the child is having challenges and it's not working, we're going to tweak it. And that's what happens in life too. If things don't work, we adjust to it. And because this child is a little adult or little being and is not able to say things, that doesn't mean that that child cannot still express themselves. And with autism, we have it's a spectrum. So there's the kids who have more needs than others, but just learn and be forgiving to yourself. Yes, you had this child, but it's not your fault. Don't feel guilty and don't be ashamed. Ask.
Thank you. I want to
I wanted to add a little.
Go ahead. Perfect.
So one thing that my panelists also have talked about is being very forgiving of yourself. But when we talk about communication and especially their little ones, or really our older ones too, that are learning to communicate, we have to realize that communication for those children, it's going to be very self-centered, right? So if you have a child who likes certain snacks, that's what they're going to be requesting, right? And if they like certain TV shows, that's what they're going to be requesting. A student with autism, communication is their biggest challenge. And as a therapist, I used to always get jealous because I would say, wow, I just can't, I can't help this child. He's not doing well in speech. And the OT is always like, oh, but he's doing great with OT. Because it's not that it's easier, but it's a different skill. When you have a child with learning disabilities, and specifically autism, communication is the hardest thing, okay? And so now I'm gonna go a little bit off on my tangent. Verbal communication, that's typically how we learn to speak. And for a child who has autism, that's really not their language. most of our children with autism or significant communication disabilities, they're visual communicators. And so you can think about how, how your child functions in the house. They look at you, they watch you. They might be able to imitate a movement. That's easier for them. They might be able to, their attention for certain things are so steadfast. They have attention to things that they like, but other things that they may not prefer, they're not going to attend to. But we found in general that our students with autism, their language is visual language, and that goes to some of the needs that they might have and some of the supports that you may have to seek out, because we know that as a child is developing language, well, I'm going to backtrack. When you have a child with special needs, they're not going to develop fine motor, gross motor, speech at the same time. So you may find that your child is learning to walk and they're doing great, or they're learning to put pegs into a grid and they're doing great, but they're not speaking yet. And what I've learned as a therapist and as a parent is that it doesn't all come at one point and what time. So sometimes we have to scaffold our children in their ability to communicate by providing visuals, by providing sign language. And when you think about it, this is really how we communicate these days. Like, I'm sure everyone here has an iPhone, and we sometimes respond back with an emoji, or we're sending a picture, and that's describing how we're feeling at that time. Those are the types of symbols that we're talking about. They're almost universal symbols that we can use with some of our children to help them understand, like more, which is sign language, or all done. We can use gestures and we can use pictures. And these are typical supports. Like, I was thinking about this on my way here, like when your father is mad at you or your parents are mad at you, like they'll give you like a look, and they're not saying anything to you. That's your visual communication. They're telling you knock it off. So we are accustomed as communicators to really communicate using a variety of different means: verbal, visual, gestural. So we can utilize the visual and the gestural supports to help our students that don't have verbal language yet. So I can go on to that forever. But,
And we can listen for forever, really. It's to my understanding that you have some things that you would like to share. So as you get that ready, I'm going to ask Dr. Skolnick another question. Going back to what you said earlier, Dr. Skolnick, you mentioned about that parents should take care of themselves and tend to their needs so that they can then support their child. The next question on my list is, my child is constantly misbehaving or melting down when we go out into public. How can I address this, and what can I do?
So, again, it does take being calm in those moments, right? It could be stressful for everyone when you take your child out, and we know children with autism have an insistence on sameness or routine, and when that routine is broken, they might melt down or become frustrated, or they might lack the communication skills and become frustrated when you're not understanding them, right? And so these are things that can cause them to have huge emotional reactions in public. So again, what we don't want to have happen is have the parent to also then have their own little temper tantrum, which I'm guilty of myself, and my children have melted down in public, and it's not a fun thing to go through. It can be helpful, to assess, to try to understand. I mentioned there's different causes to what can lead to these misbehaviors or emotional overreactions. Sometimes we have what's more of a temper tantrum, right? Which is usually, you can kind of tell the difference between a temper tantrum and a meltdown, although a temper tantrum can become a meltdown. But oftentimes the tantrum is more behavioral, like I want this thing now and you're not giving it to me, and I'm going to engage in this behavior until until I get it, right? And so the last thing you want to do then is to give them the thing they're going to want when they're temper tantruming, right? Because that's just going to teach them when I throw my hands up and I yell and scream, I'm going to get what I want. If you're at Target and you're shopping, you may have to go into the parking lot and go back to your car and, let them have it out until they are calm and open to communication and understand, I'm not going to get what I want. And there may be consequences. But with, emotional meltdowns, as we mentioned, there's a lot of things that can make children with autism upset or sad or not heard. And, it's our job as parents to try to be empathetic and to be patient. It might take them longer to calm down in those situations. It might be harder for them. We might have to model deep breathing. We might have to get them some of their sensory tools. We might have to get them to an environment that's calmer. And so there's not one way to deal with it, but as I just keep going back to stay calm as yourself, and so you can use good judgment in those situations and not make the problem worse.
Thank you, Dr. Skolnick. Thank you for sharing that answer. I think you wanted to add on to what he said.
Yes. So transitions are very scary. If you think about if you're in an area that you didn't speak the language and someone is just dragging you from place to place, there is a feeling that's terrifying, and especially for a child with autism who doesn't speak verbal language. So a lot of times as a speech pathologist, we try to really prepare our children ahead. And this is probably something you're already doing. So I always think about when I would go to my sister's house, and I would tell my kids, okay, we're gonna go to Dee Dee's house. When you go in, you're going to kiss everyone hello. Now you're gonna sit down and you're gonna sit there and behave. So was like my expectation. I'm telling them where we're going, I'm telling them who they're gonna see, and then I'm telling them how they're supposed to behave. So when we have students who don't understand language, we have to give them the same sort of supports. So sometimes you may see like a first then. So you might see something like this, and they might be pictures. Like first we're going to go somewhere, and then you can take a break. So again, like this is some of the language you're already using, but because our children with special needs, their first language isn't verbal language, they need visual supports. We have to provide them visual supports so they understand the expectations, and then they also understand that once this is done, I'm going to be able to take a break. And sometimes with repetition and practice, some of those meltdowns we can avoid, right? Because we're telling them their expectations before we're bringing them to their next place, and when we're letting them know what to expect. I think about even if you start your day, Monday mornings, I look at my schedule and I say, okay, this is what I have to do the whole week. But I have a calendar, and this is essentially what we're doing. When I look at my calendar, I'll say, okay, Monday's a pretty easy day. Tuesday is going to be absolutely terrible. So I know I have to, pick up dinner that day because I'm not going to be able to do it. I know my limits. When we have a child with special needs, they're being dragged, right? And not that anyone's doing anything wrong. We're doing this because we have to function as a family. Listen, I got to get you up, out, and onto that bus. You need to get to wherever you need to be because I need to get to my job, and everyone has expectations in the house. So by incorporating some visuals, and now for our students, and this is something that a speech pathologist does, also a special ed teacher, and all of us, we all use visuals, but what we try to do is we try to depict some of the language that we use in a symbol. So that if you speak Italian, Spanish, any sort of language, right? These symbols are pretty universal so that everyone can understand. And we're really doing this for our child who doesn't process verbal language. We want to teach them the symbol so that they learn what the concepts mean. And this doesn't mean that your child will never understand what the language is. But again, going back to when we have a child with special needs and they're developing different skills, well, while they're working on getting, refining their fine motor skills, learning how to zipper or learning how to button, they still need to be able to understand the language. So we call it like a scaffold, like we're helping them out. We're helping them learn language while they are getting really good at one thing, but we want to make sure that they're not suffering by not understanding what they're doing. So I use a lot of pictures, right? And if we look at ourselves and what we do in our daily life, we use emojis, we use calendars, we use visuals, we use timers, Miss Fola. But we do this because we know we need the supports. It helps us to function, and it provides us that the support that we need so that we can get through our day successfully.
When we talk about visuals as well, what I'll do is, as an OT, when I'm working with a child and I'm having difficulty, for instance, if I'm doing dressing and it has to do with buttoning, because one of the skills or one of the skills for living as a child is to get dressed. You want that child to become independent. That child is having a challenge because they're having sensory challenges. So all those things are being addressed. But when I have a visual, I'll go to the speech language pathologist and I'll say, I need this because my child is not doing certain things. She gives us the visuals. I'll work with the child. She would work with the child. If the child is having a meltdown, we'll go to the school psychologist who will help with the breathing exercise. So we work as a team, and we pick each other's brains so that we're able to help that child within that school environment.
I am so grateful for all of those answers from Dr. Skolnick, Ms. Baragato, Ms. Oshikonlu. It sounds like a lot of what we're supposed to be doing at home is also being done at the schools. And it sounds like consistency, practicing, learning your child, because you are your child's expert, right? You know your child the best before they even step into the school. Doing things at home, trying it at home, and then going to the people who work with your child outside of the home and saying, this is what we're doing, this is what's working, this is what's not working, how can I be supported? So it really is a team effort. At this moment, I just want to remind anyone, if you have any questions, even if you're online, to kind of make note of it, so that we can begin the Q&A portion of this. So if there's anyone, just give a wave and the ushers will come around with.
Praise the Lord. Well, thank you so much to the panel. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for your time. I know that if we keep at it, our plan was from 12 to 2. And so if we keep at it, we'll be here till 4 p.m. So I'm going to ask a few questions that I have. If you have questions, please write them down or raise your hand and we'll ask. And if I say how many questions I have, I know some people will panic. I have 10 questions. And why I'm doing it that way is so that you could just come to it, intermittently, I'm sure. So for example, what is autism? I know we sort of mentioned it. What are the different types or learning disabilities? There are people here that don't know, we're talking above their heads. Number 2, what are the causes of autism? I know that, they may be varied. We may not be able to get to every single one, but please give us some idea. And if you need me to recap after I sit down, I wrote it down. So what are the steps you must take once you notice that something may be wrong with a child or an infant? And what should you look out for in terms of markers for children? Because if we say from birth to 3 is early intervention, okay, what are we looking out for from birth to 3? What are the resources available in the school district, like step by step? If somebody notices that there's a problem, what should they do? Or, in terms of the resources that are available. What support is available for children with autism is sort of the same thing. And what support is available for parents? Like, Dr. Skolnick said, parents must look after themselves. Are there groups, like support groups that parents could join that could be helpful? And then this is now, the conspiracy theorist area now. So, do vaccines cause autism? Do you know? If you don't, that's fine. Can autism be cured? I see so many videos where they said playing outdoors, running in the field, running on monkey bars, doing all these things that people used to do before help children, and we don't do them anymore because we're always on the computers. Food. I've seen documentaries that all these processed foods may cause autism. So do we start growing our own food and all those kind of things? And is it true that if kids have autism, things like music, art, and other non-verbal activities may be helpful? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. We'll start with the first question of what is autism? Just from the basic blocks. So what is it and what causes it? Can it be cured?
So autism is it's not defined by a blood test. It's not medically diagnosed. It's a set of behaviors. So it's a behavioral diagnosis, and it's very heterogeneous, meaning that if you met one one individual with autism, you don't know autism because the next individual might look very different. And we have individuals with very low intellectual abilities and very high intellectual abilities and no language and lots of language. So it's a really hard thing to pin down, but the behaviors that are identified are twofold. So there's deficits in social communication. So that could be the social reciprocity, nonverbal communication. So we may have lots of language, but not have the sort of the sarcasm or modulating the volume of your voice or facial expressions. Some people with autism have difficulty with what's called joint attention. So like I'm here with you and you're here with me and we're here together and we're focused on one another. So those are some examples of the social communication deficits. A lot of children, again, don't develop language. They may eventually develop normal language, but at an early age, they're not developing much language at all. And the second diagnostic criteria is restricted and repetitive behaviors, which could mean playing the same way, lining up toys a certain way. It could be listening to the same song over and over again. It could be repeating the same line from a movie over and over again. It can be flapping your hands over again, seeking the same sensory input. So there's this emphasis on repetition and sameness that would be the second criteria for an autism diagnosis.
So autism is a pattern of differences in language, social communication, and then also behaviors. Just in terms of what to look out for, I know most people, everyone here takes their child to a pediatrician. And when you go to those visits, especially early on, especially in the first few months of life, you go every month and then eventually every 3 months. And then as your child gets to age 3, then you go every year. When your child goes to the doctor, they ask you a series of questions. And if your doctor is like mine, they'd probably send you the questions earlier on where they say, does your child crawl? Does your child look when the doors open? Does your child point, right? Those are all milestone questions that they ask you, not just because they're being nosy or to waste time, but those are the milestones or the things that you should be looking for. And they're in the different areas of development. So if you notice that, especially in one area, that your child is not doing those things consistently every time you go to the visit, and it's no, they're not doing it, no, and you're trying to crack your brain to think of it, chances are there's maybe something you should look further into. Just as a parent, if you're like me, I downloaded a number of apps when my first child was born, and I actually was tracking his development myself, and I was able to see the different patterns. There's YouTube, there's the internet, and not so much to look for conspiracies, but just to also see there's channels that you can use to see, okay, what activities can I do with my child, when they're 1 month old, 6 months old, 1 year old to support their development. So I just kind of wanted to take that off your plate just as a parent. But what are some types of learning challenges or disabilities that you see the most often other than autism?
So I work in special education. So some of the more prevalent learning challenges are attentional issues. So about 7% of the population with ADHD. A smaller percentage of individuals who have learning disabilities, right? So like dyslexia, dysgraphia, difficulty with reading and writing or math. We have a lot of children, especially in early childhood, with speech and language impairments that we have excellent therapists, and a lot of times, a lot of those skills are remediated by middle to high school, but we still have those who still have speech and language impairments into adulthood. At the high school level, I'm seeing a lot of children with emotional disabilities, difficulties just regulating their mood, regulating their anxiety, etc. So there is help for all of these these conditions, and they're out there through medical insurance and finding specialists privately. But you have a great resource in your school district, again from the ages of 3 to 21, who will offer free assessments and have a variety of professionals like us who can help your child.
Apart from autism and ADHD and then also physical challenges, what I also see is kids who have dyslexia. You talked about dysgraphia, and they're kids who are not able to read. So basically, they see the book, they see the letters, but their brain is not interpreting what they're reading. So what we have is assistive technology that reads the information to them, because when they hear it, they're able to understand and they're able to respond. We see that a lot. Then we also, we were talking a few minutes ago, we see a lot of kids with different challenges. But what we have noticed is that because there is no diagnosis, there's a loss of power. So when you have the diagnosis, you can go forward and say, this is what my child is diagnosed with. I need this. Recently, I was at a CSC and the parent had refused the diagnosis and the child couldn't get any assistance because the parent did not want that child. And when I say CSC, it's a meeting for the for the parents and the team. And the parent had said, no, I don't want you to label my child. But there was nothing that could be done because what are we addressing? And we're seeing that we're losing a lot of ability to help the kid at a young age because we're denying. But we're denying sometimes because of our pride, and we're denying sometimes because of our ignorance. So the idea is find out, research, like you said, Mrs. Agbabiaka, find out what's going on, find out what is available, and then ask. And then you will be able to get the assistance that that child needs. And the goal is to get the assistance the child needs.
Just in thinking about the stigma, and there is a stigma. It's in our society, and there are people who may make assumptions about you, or maybe that's just in our imagination if we know that we have a child who's different. But what we also know is that children will become teenagers, will become adults, and those who have learning or emotional or social disabilities that are untreated, they're at a higher likelihood to drop out of school, to feel bad about themselves, to use drugs and alcohol. So the outcome, it may be just take the act of courage, or it may be really hard initially to ask for help. But if you think about the long-term consequences of not getting help, it becomes an easier decision.
Thank you. We have an influx of questions that came in, so I'm going to try to group some of them together because a lot of them are asking similar things. The one that came up actually quite often was, is autism genetic? And is there any genetic testing that can help to forestall having a child with autism? And then also going into pregnancy, is there anything that's done in pregnancy or not done in pregnancy that may cause autism?
I wouldn't say that that's any of, I'm not sure if you guys have expertise in that area. But there are some studies like twin studies, just looking at heritability. Like if you're a parent with autism, you're more likely to have a child with autism. If you have twins, it's identical twins especially, it's very highly likely that both will have autism, which does show, and I think they've found some genetic underpinnings to autism. But there's also an interaction with the environment as well. And I don't know that they've identified those. There's some conspiracies about what those are. But there's always an interaction between nature and nurture. But yes, there's definitely a genetic component to it.
I think I want to speak a little bit towards the genetics. So yes, and I feel like sometimes when we look at families, we can say, oh, he's just like, his uncle. He's just like my brother. He's just, So in terms of some behaviors, sometimes you can see that there's some similarities between your child who may have some special needs and some members of your family. But one thing that I think is just so important is that is really the support at a young age. So if you ask that family member who maybe your child is like, what was it like growing up for you? What were your struggles in school? As parents, we want to eliminate those struggles. We want our children to be successful. We want them to be able to learn. So sometimes when you speak to these family members and they could say, yeah, I hated school. Or I have a brother-in-law who really struggled in school, and I have a son that's similar to him. And he ended up dropping out because he didn't get the special services he needed. So what that just did is it compounded into his feeling of not being good enough and not going to school. And as an adult, he's now successful, but there were a lot of hurdles that he overcame because of all the struggles and because he didn't have the support that we have the opportunity to have, especially living in this area in Long Island. We have the ability to really, there's a lot of services here, and we're very fortunate to have it. So again, going back to, sometimes a diagnosis is not the worst thing. As a parent, it could break your heart, right? Because you have these perfect children, and so the last thing you want to hear is a diagnosis that there's so many different interpretations of what it can mean. But what I try to tell my parents and my family members is, with a diagnosis, that's the power you have to say, hey, my child has difficulty with this. Now I'm going to get the service to help. Has difficulty with that. Now I'm going to get the support I need. Because I don't want him to struggle like his uncle or his cousin or my brother did. I want him to be able to be successful and not have to work so hard at the things that are going to be his obstacles. If it makes any sense.
Thank you. That's such an insightful answer. I wanted to address one of the questions that said, how do I know when to get help or how to get help? If you notice a pattern of differences in your child, first things first, speak to your child's pediatrician, speak to your child's teacher. Ms. Oshikolu said earlier, the CSE, which is a committee of special education. As a parent, you're a part of that committee. So if you have concerns, it's not just the teacher or the people in the school or the doctor who can bring it up. You yourself can refer your child to early intervention services. You can bring that up to the school. You can bring that to the district and kind of initiate this process. So you don't have to wait for it to be initiated. If they do the evaluation and find that your child is eligible, then other things will go into play. If your child is not eligible, they will give you resources or strategies to try with your child. So there's no harm or no knowledge lost when going through this process. A question that has come up multiple times is is there medication to treat autism or anything to aid in reversal?
Again, none of us are medical doctors, so I'm not going to be recommending specific medications, but many of our children do, see neurologists or psychiatrists, and that is a part of their treatment plan. But oftentimes the treatment is multifaceted, so it's going to come from the parent, from the psychologist, from the speech therapist, the occupational therapist, and medication may be one of the ingredients, but there's no medication that's going to cure or completely, stop all the symptoms that you're working on or behaviors that still need professional help with.
This question, what are your thoughts on redirecting for behavioral issues, such as physically spanking, is what it says. It says, what are your thoughts on spanking for redirecting behavioral issues? I was trying to find a way to say it nicely.
Yes.
That's not a sensory meltdown, it's specified.
Okay. All right, so as someone who has been previously spanked, so I can speak to, I get it. I think that you have to look at the whole situation. I mean, we try. As therapists, we're gonna say, no spanking. Okay, no spanking. But look at the situation and look at the teachable moment, right? So this, again, going back to expectations, knowing your child's thresholds. If you have a child that can't sit through service, then maybe you're only at service for 10 or 15 minutes. And because you want a positive experience, right? So when you look at the activities in your life, if you can get through that activity and complete it to whatever your child's threshold is, and it's positive, that's going to teach your child that it's a safe thing to do, and it's going to increase the chances that you would have another positive experience. So we try to be aware of their needs. So now you're, again, back to, the sensory needs, behavioral needs. Did they sleep? Did you sleep? Did you sleep so that you can make it through service? So there's a lot of things that go through when you're thinking about a redirection. But I think that focusing on what you can do before whatever activity you're going to be a part of to make it successful, because we know that spanking is not positive. We've all probably been spanked, and it could be a quick fix, but it's an emotional fix that there's no one that I know that doesn't have a story about a spanking, and it's not like it changed their life in a positive way. So we try to make it positive by creating a better environment, right, Dr. Skolnick, so that the experience is positive in nature.
Also, when we talk about spanking, first, what does that child need at that time? Why is that? So we're talking about the ABCs. Why is that child doing what they're doing at that particular time? What is the sensory integration that's going on with that child? What stimuli is going on, and why is that child responding the way they're responding? So if we get to know why the child does what they do, we talked about timers. We could set a timer. We could reward systems. Okay, you're doing this, and then the first this, then you get that. So giving them, okay, you can sit here for 1 minute. We set the 1 minute timer, and when the kid sits for 1 minute, gets probably 2 minutes break, and you celebrate that 1 minute. Sometimes when we're in therapy, we look like we're crazy people because the child said, "Yay, you did it!" And we're running around with the kid and dancing. Some people will say, "Why are you dancing for just 1 minute?" That is 1 minute of success. Then you now make it 2 minutes. The next time it's 5 minutes. Then it's 10 minutes. And you start seeing progress. Also, we talk about healing. Healing comes in different ways. The fact that my child can communicate with me using one of those boards, that is healing, because that child is able to tell me what that need is at that time. The healing might not be the way I want the healing to be, but what I have to do is look at my child at that time, and it's what we call episode of care. What care does that child need at that time? And how can I address that period and help that child at that time? So if I spank that child's need hasn't been addressed. I hope that makes sense.
It does.
Oh, I'm just going to add one more thing. I'm sorry. Okay. So again, when I went into speech therapy, initially I wasn't working with a population of such significant communication needs. But one thing that I've learned, and if I can share anything, is like the tiny successes. Sometimes as parents, we want the big picture. We want them to be able to go to Target, come back. We want them to be able to do these things that maybe aren't 100% age appropriate for a child, or at least for a child that has some differing needs. So we call it in therapy like, like backward chaining or task analysis. But think about your overall goal. And if the goal is to be able to sit at church or in a service, then you're going to make your tiny successes, right? So back to what you were saying, you're able to sit for a minute, we're going to celebrate that. Well, again, for a child who can't sit, a minute's a long time, and it is a wonderful thing to celebrate. So sometimes we have to focus, we have an overall goal for our children as parents, and we have to kind of break them up into tiny goals. And that is something, as a parent and as a therapist, helps us to feel like, okay, we're on the right track and we're doing a good job. We need to see some success too, especially when we're shaping, changing our behaviors and trying to help our child. Success is good for everybody.
I would say that there's probably no place for spanking a child, but that's just my opinion. That doesn't mean there's not a place for punishment and consequences. But punishment and consequences don't necessarily teach your child what to do. They teach them what not to do. Right. So my daughter, just personal story, was kind of just back talking and not being very. And I had redirected her once and twice and 3 times to use kind words, and she didn't. So the consequence was the loss of one of her favorite things, which is her iPad. So there is a place for consequences, but there's also being very clear about what you're expecting from your child, and then celebrating when they are able to do it, because that does send a message to them that, okay, this is what mom and dad want me to do, right? I was able to, tolerate a whole trip to Target with, maybe for me, one meltdown is good, right? If you look at it that way, then you can show praise and give feedback that reinforces good behavior and doesn't necessarily, you're not focusing on punishing bad behavior all the time. And punishment can be a quick fix, but then, and it can teach the parent that works. But then when that becomes your go-to or the only tool in your toolbox, we need to learn other skills to promote and reward, whether it's cheering or praising or a sticker chart or eventually getting you that toy that you wanted because you were behaving all month. Those things can be more powerful tools to teach what to do.
So no spanking. So you spoke about the antecedent, or finding out what comes before the behavior and noticing that pattern, what the behavior looks like, and what an appropriate consequence could be. So as you continue to track those or see like, okay, I notice every time we go to a certain place or do a certain thing, this behavior comes up, getting to know your child more so that you can address those things even before they come up. My next question is, from an anxious mom with a teenager. She says, for a child with behavior problems and social struggles, does it get better in adulthood? So no, the mom is anxious. She says, for a child with behavior problems and social struggles, does it get better in adulthood?
I think it goes back again to, did you ask for help or not? Right? So there can be very good outcomes for an individual who goes to therapy or seeks support, or or they go to their church and they're honest about the things that they need to work on. The outcomes tend to be better for those who just worry about their child and don't actually take the steps to make any changes. And sometimes you do everything right and you go to therapy and you seek the help, and unfortunately it doesn't always work out immediately. Or as someone who's a psychologist, I'm intimately familiar with my own emotional difficulties, and sometimes they do creep back in adulthood, and I have to go back and relearn how to use those strategies that I learned as a teenager. So, but the one way it will never get better is if you do nothing about it. So it can get better.
Thank you. And it seems like that question also addresses part of this question, but I'll ask it in case there's any additional input. It says, how can we help children that were diagnosed later on in life because of where we come from and are now adults and still struggling? So it seems like as the church begins to get more information and as they begin to learn more about their children, some people are getting help and realizing a little bit later on in life, maybe school age, that their child does need support. What can we do, or what can they do if they're still struggling even though they're receiving those supports?
So if they're diagnosed later.
Yeah, they were diagnosed later, receiving support, but still struggling.
Just make sure you're following the interventions put forth and by the experts that your children are working with. Sometimes later in life might mean. So obviously, children's brains are the most plastic, or when they're very young, but they're still very malleable and can be changed throughout their teens and early adulthood. So there's still hope if you refer your child late.
I think also that following up with what Dr. Skolnick was saying, I think that there's that we have to seek out programs, and there are a lot of programs. And I know that we're past COVID, but it doesn't sometimes feel like we're super past COVID. But especially in certain areas of Long Island, and I think even the town of Hempstead, there are some adult programs, and I think that that seeking out maybe some additional supports, they're there, but they're not always easy to find. And I don't know if there's a referral service or if there's a contact that maybe that we could find out, but there are some adult supports, and it's just a matter of in terms of what kind of program you need, and of those natures, social programs as well. But I think it's sometimes we have to dig a little bit to find them, but maybe.
Mm-hmm. Knowing about the Office for Persons with Developmental Disabilities, OPWDD, they help children transition into adulthood, right? So some children with autism may have therapy all their life, and they may still need a lot of support, and they may not live independently as adults, and they may never have a normal job, or they may never get married and have children. That's okay. There's supports for individuals of all levels, of all ability levels, and all ages.
Thank you. You guys touched upon a lot of that question, which is awesome. I want to reiterate early intervention. Again, that's from birth to 3, and the technical department is actually going to put up that information if you want to just jot it down for Nassau County. As I ask my next question, how can I help my child navigate and build relationships, social situations, and build relationships? I'm assuming with autism or with a learning difference.
I try to, when I work with parents, what are your children interested in? Can you build interests with them? Some of the best things you could do is, if you can get them into martial arts or sports, or if those things are too sometimes sports can be too overwhelming because there's a lot of winning and losing, and every time you strike out, you want to have a meltdown. But it can be finding activities that are maybe involve fewer people, but people that have shared interests. Sometimes, I find a lot of children with autism are interested in gaming and comic books, and those are the things that turn them on. And so it's finding like-minded individuals, and it might mean joining a club at school, it might mean going online. But we're fortunate enough to live in the 21st century where we can find, people that our children can feel comfortable with and develop relationships with.
I think I want to piggyback on this. So again, if your child, if the school knows the struggles, then the schools can work on the struggles. So as a speech therapist, sometimes we do spend therapy in a group, working on social situations, working on playing games. Sometimes they're electronic, but sometimes they're, card games like we used to play. But that practice in school helps with the generalization, helps that child. The more practice they have, the easier it will be to start putting that action into practice. So that's where the school supports this.
What also happens again in schools is if your child is getting therapy, any kind of therapy, usually there's a communication book that goes from home to the school. Don't hesitate to ask questions. Don't feel like you're a pest. Know who your therapist is, who is the occupational therapist, who is the physical therapist, who is the speech language pathologist who's working with the child. What are you doing during the session? What can I duplicate when I get home? What is it that I'm duplicating when I get home and it's not working with that child? How can I tweak things? Something that came up with one of the students that I had a few years ago was, he is a Nigerian child, and it was a feeding issue. The child loved amala, and that's all the child ate. When he came to school and he was given food, he would not chew because he was used to swallowing. I happened to go into that classroom and I said to them, it's because all he does is he swallows. So now he has to learn a new repertoire and he has to learn that. And you as the therapist also have to learn that there are cultural diversity, and this child is from a different culture and you have to learn our culture as well. So it was a teachable moment, and those are things that we can also communicate using the communication book that goes back and forth from the home. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If they say you're a pest, well, you're a pest for your child because you're your child's best advocate. And that's the only way you can help that child. And that's the way you can learn about your child. Because the more you know about your child, the better you can help that child. And then you're sensitive to that child's needs, and you can say, oh, we're going here today, this is what I need to prep my child. And we go on from there.
Thank you. And that brings to mind also something that I wanted to mention. A service that's also available is parent counseling. So if your child receives a diagnosis of autism or something of that nature, they offer parent counseling either monthly or sometimes twice a month so that you can continue to receive education on the different needs of your child as they begin to change. The last question that I wanted to bring up, and I really wanted Ms. Ashikolan to talk about sensory diet and really sensitivity to especially noise or other things, in the environment.
We're participants in this world, and you and I, as we go through life, we take a lot of things for granted. I am speaking now. There's a lot of noise going on behind me, but I can suppress that noise and continue continue talking with everyone here. A child who has autism might be distracted by that. And that noise, as loud as it is, I am able to just forget about it. But because it is giving that child more or less like a fight or flight mode, so that child will cover their ears and say, no, I don't want to hear it. as an OT, what I'll do is work with that child. So what is the need that child has? And we'll prepare what is called a sensory diet. So how much sensory stimuli am I adding to desensitize that child, or to get that child used to the noise so that child can filter through and continue to participate in the environment. Another example is you can go to Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts and get coffee. And as you're getting coffee, you're walking out, you can cross the road, you can have a conversation with somebody else, because you're able to put everything in compartments. But the child with autism has a challenge putting things in that compartment. So what would happen is a diet is provided to give that child just enough to tolerate, to self-regulate, and I don't want to use big terms, to modulate that information that's coming in, and then be able to navigate the environment. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes months, but the therapist would work with that child. And it's also the same. There's some things that we cannot really get that child desensitized from, like tags on the back of their clothes. The best thing is cut the tags off. There's some kids who now they have socks that don't have seams. So you get an outfit without seams. So those things is, once you get to know the child, you're able to prep the diet and the sensory diet, and it's adjusted from time to time. Like, this works, this doesn't work. I need to give this child more of this stimuli, because probably the child is seeking a lot of stimuli, just so that he knows where he or she is in place. So those are things that are involved in the sensory diet, and it takes an occupational therapist and the rest of the team to go through it and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. One of the things we also do is, for instance, if it's speech and the child is not able to produce, I would probably sit with a speech therapist and would work on things so that we can expand the lungs while that child is trying to produce words. So there's so many things. It's intricate, but it's gradual, and we get there. It's always one day at a time.
Thank you. I know I said that was the last question, but some of our online viewers submitted some questions that I believe everyone would benefit from. So just very quickly, 3 more questions. My son is 6 years old and autistic. Apart from the fact that he is experiencing a speech delay, he does not eat. He has been on a smoothie all his life. We tried feeding therapy, even from his specialized school. What can we do?
Spoon-fed?
So they're on this puree diet.
Okay. I think that as some schools have feeding teams, but as a parent, when you see that the feeding team is not giving enough, not that you're saying that they, there's some interventions that some students respond to. If the feeding team in your child's school, if the family's not getting the success that they need, then they have to refer to something that might be a little bit more direct in terms of feeding, if there is a medical necessity. And that would be, in this area, typically St. Mary's is the hospital that specializes in feeding. The information, I don't have the information, is if this child is like a failure to thrive, is he not gaining weight, or is the challenges with feeding maybe more like what's the parameters of what that child is eating? Is that child eating protein? Sometimes when we have a child with feeding needs, it may not look like that child is eating typical for us, but they might be getting the nutrition that they need right now for growth. So when there's challenges with feeding, I think my concern would be if the child is gaining weight, and really taking a look at what that child is eating. And if the family is worried and the child is not gaining weight, then needs to be a referral for medical assistance.
So if that feeding team isn't working, explore somewhere else.
Yes.
Because what we want to do is adjust, adapt, and modify. So that's what she has to do. And it might be challenging to start with. I don't know if she's here.
That person is physically here.
Okay, so those are places, those are things she could do. And she could reach out to us and we'll find out, because I don't have answers now. She could, because there's certain things that have to be asked. We'll find out and we'll see how we can help in this
Yes.
area.
Thank you. And not to hijack it, but I also have experience. I have a child who went through feeding therapy for 10 months, and we went through multiple programs. The first program didn't work, the second program didn't work, and we found that the third program through St. Mary's Pediatric Feeding Center, we had a lot of success. So don't be afraid, just because one approach or one thing doesn't work, doesn't mean that's the end of it. Feeding is something that's very important. Growth and development is all depending on nutrition. If your child is not eating or only dependent on purees, other things can be impacted. Also, in terms of speech, I'm not a speech therapist. I'm just speaking from my child's experience. The next question, to Dr. Skolnick, you said that the government pays for services up until the age 21. After 21, where do the funds come from to support adults in getting services?
I think when I said the government, I was mentioning just public education. But as I mentioned, adults that need assistance will go to something like OPWDD. Frequently, that is through Medicaid. There's a process of accessing that I don't have a lot of expertise in. So I'd urge you to reach out. There are resources out there that can help you get linked up with adult services. And sometimes that may mean going through your own private health insurance, paying out of pocket, but there's access to supports if you know where to look.
Thank you. And this is actually the last question. It says, I live in a house with multiple kids, so there's multiple children. How do you deal with the situation where the autistic child does not like noise, but the rest are very noisy? What are toys or things that can help? So maybe with siblings, how to create an environment that they can, have.
Okay. I would say the first thing I would make sure that I have, and you can pick it up on Home Depot on the way home, is noise canceling headphones. Because there's going to be some times that we just can't make things quiet. But if you're able to teach your child that if he utilizes headphones and he can minimize the outside noise, that could be something that could create calmness in your child. I also think that if you have the ability to make some sort of area that could be quiet, closed, calm for that child, that would be great. Not always the case, right? So sometimes education with the other children, again, knowing your child with special needs, knowing the thresholds and knowing when he has had enough, or he or she, and he needs quiet time. Just being more aware of that child's needs, you could help educate the whole family in terms of what can happen now and sometimes what can't happen now. Think about when you have a newborn at home, there might be times that, a lot of activity is okay, but there might be times when you just can't have it. And maybe trying to put in some of those boundaries. I know it's not easy. Maybe it means that the kids go outside and your child with autism has to stay inside because just he needs whatever, or she needs what they need to refill their, I want to say refill their bucket, but they need to be able to monitor themselves and feel more regulated. But I think, again, it goes to identifying your child with special needs, their physical and sensory needs, and really helping, having everyone be aware of that, and maybe being, I guess, more aware. And I don't know, I'm trying to about creating boundaries so that everyone in the family knows how to help your child with special needs.
Sometimes what you also want to do is you want to give a name to the time that child needs his time, like his me time. So you could say it's so time, and then the other kids know that at this time, this child needs that quiet. So let him have that time, and we'll say, okay, and that's where our timers come in again. For this amount of time, just let this child just have that quiet time.
And maybe even identifying the activities. So sometimes we have children that love the bathtub because they're getting their sensory needs. So sometimes there's some families that I've heard stories, that they're like, oh, my child wants to take 2 showers a day, 2 baths a day. And it's really not because they feel dirty, is because that is an area in their household that they're calm. So again, maybe just being more aware of certain activities that help that child to become calm and the environment that's needed, and then working around that so that child gets what they need.
Sometimes what we have to do is change our time and arrange a time around that child. It's not always what you want to do, but sometimes it's the best thing to do at that time.
Yeah.
And then eventually you kind of win yourself from it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Skolnick, Ms. Oshikolu, Mrs. Baragato. Thank you so much for your time, for your expertise. We don't take it for granted. For everyone, if you have any other questions, please feel free to submit them to myself, and I will make sure that the information gets passed along. I also want to use this opportunity to just say thank you, but we also have a small token of appreciation for all of the panelists, participants. I didn't think this through when I put it so far away.
Let's put our hands together again for the panelists. Thank you, thank you, thank you.